We're reading from Little House in the Big Woods. The chapter we're on is called Sundays, which is on page 83, which is appropriate since today is Sunday, and I'm reading to you. Um, so, one of the things you have to know before we start this chapter is that in the olden days, a lot of churches felt that Sunday was a day of rest. It says in the Bible that Sunday is the day when we rest. And so resting meant that you didn't play, you didn't do any kind of jobs at your house, you didn't go shopping, um, or do any kind of chores around the house. Um, all the other days of the week were days when that would happen. And so we're going to read a little bit about Sunday and why it's kind of a difficult day for kids because it's hard for them to stay still, right? And not play. Sundays. This is the illustration. Shows, sorry, this is a little bit blurry, but it shows Laura with her doll, Charlotte, remember? Now the winter seemed long. Laura and Mary began to be tired of staying always in the house, especially on Sundays. The time went so slowly. Every Sunday, Mary and Laura were dressed from the skin out in their best clothes, with fresh ribbons in their hair. They were very clean because they had their baths on Saturday night. In the summer, they were bathed in water from the spring, but in the winter time, Pa filled and heaped the washtub with clean snow, and on the cook stove it melted to water. Then, close by the warm stove, behind a screen made of a blanket over two chairs, Ma bathed Laura, and then she bathed Mary. Laura was bathed first because she was littler than Mary. She had to go to bed early on Saturday nights with Charlotte because after she was bathed and put into her clean nightgown, Pa must empty the washtub and fill it with snow again for Mary's bath. Then, after Mary came to bed, Ma had her bath behind the blanket, and then Pa had his, and then they were all clean for Sunday. On Sundays, Mary and Laura must not run or shout or be noisy in their play. Mary could not sew on her 9-patch quilt, and Laura could not knit on the tiny mittens she was making for baby Carrie. They might look quietly at their paper dolls, but they must not make anything new for them. They were not allowed to sew on doll clothes, not even with pins. They must sit quietly and listen while Ma read Bible stories to them, or stories about lions and tigers and white bears from Pa's big green book, The Wonders of the Animal World. They might look at pictures, and they might hold their rag dolls nicely and talk to them, but there was nothing else they could do. Laura liked best to look at the pictures in the big Bible with its paper covers. Best of all was the picture of Adam naming the animals. Adam sat on a rock, and all the animals and birds, big and little, were gathered around him, anxiously waiting to be told what kind of animals they were. Adam looked so comfortable. He did not have to be careful to keep his clothes clean, because he had no clothes on. He wore only a skin around his middle. Did Adam have good clothes to wear on Sundays? Laura asked Ma. That's an awesome question. No, Ma said. Poor Adam. All he had to wear was skins. Laura did not pity Adam. She wished that she had nothing to wear but skins. One Sunday after supper, she could not bear it any longer. She began to play with Jack, and in a few minutes she was running and shouting. Pa told her to sit in her chair and be quiet, but when Laura sat down, she began to cry and kick the chair with her heels. This is a great picture. You can just see exactly, looks like a tantrum, right? Little kid tantrum. She's kicking the chair. I hate Sunday, she said. Pa put down his book. Laura, he said sternly, come here. Her feet dragged as she went because she knew that she deserved a spanking. But when she reached Pa, he looked at her sorrowfully for a moment and then took her on his knee and cuddled her against him. He held out his other arm to Mary and he said, I'm going to tell you a story about when Grandpa was a boy. This is the most awesome story ever. It's one of my favorites. So this is the picture, oops, It's called The Story of Grandpa's Sled and the Pig. When your grandpa was a boy, Laura, Sunday did not begin on Sunday morning as it does now. It began at sundown on Saturday night. Then everyone stopped every kind of work or play. Supper was solemn. Remember, we had dinner was lunch, and supper is their evening meal. Supper's the evening meal. Supper was solemn. After supper, Grandpa's father read aloud a chapter of the Bible while everyone sat straight and still in his chair. Then they all knelt down and their father said a long prayer. When he said amen, they all got up from their knees and each took a candle and went to bed. They must go straight to bed with no playing, laughing, or even talking. Sunday morning they ate a cold breakfast because nothing could be cooked on Sunday. Then they all dressed in their best clothes and walked to church. They walked because hitching up the horses was work, and no work could be done on Sunday. They must walk slowly and solemnly, looking straight ahead. They must not joke or laugh or even smile. Grandpa and his two brothers walked ahead, with their father and mother walked behind them. In church, Grandpa and his brothers must sit perfectly still for 2 long hours and listen to the sermon. They dared not fidget on the hard bench. They dared not swing their feet. They dared not turn their heads to look at the windows or the walls or the ceiling of the church. They must sit perfectly motionless and never for one instant take their eyes from the preacher. So when I was a little girl, we had a lot of the same kind of rules. We Sunday was the Sabbath day, and we were supposed to keep the Sabbath day holy, and that meant that you didn't goof around, you didn't do chores. You could take naps. I love taking naps on Sundays, or you could kind of play quietly in your room. Um, and one of my favorite things, I could not sit still. Our church was 3 hours long, and it was really hard for me to sit still. Actually, first, our church was an hour and a half long in the morning, and then there was a break when you'd have lunch, and then you'd go back later to church for another hour and a half. So it was 3 hours. And by the last hour and a half of the day, little Karen just could not hold it together. And so I would always I had a little purse that I would bring, and I would put little dolls in it, little toys in it. And I would try to sit where my parents couldn't see me very well. And then I would just get my purse out and I'd kind of start playing with all the little toys that I brought. And usually I had like a pen and some paper. And then my brother and I would play. We invented a sign language that we used that was different from regular sign language. This is Karen. I still remember it. So we could talk to each other during church and send each other little messages with sign language. And my parents would just like look at us like, oh my gosh, our kids are so naughty. So they were not allowed. They'd sit up straight in church. If they would have brought a purse with toys, they would have been clobbered. They would have been taken out to the woodshed and smacked. So this kind of makes me laugh because little Karen could not have lived in the 1800s and gone to church. They must sit perfectly motionless and never for one instant take their eyes from the preacher. When church was over, they walked slowly home. They might talk on the way, but they must not talk loudly, and they must never laugh or smile. At home, they ate a cold dinner, which had been cooked the day before. Then, all the long afternoon, they must sit in a row on a bench and study their catechism until at last the sun went down and Sunday was over. Catechism is just lessons, religious lessons that you would have. Some of you, if you're Catholic, you have a religious classes called catechism, right? My church had that too. All the kids met for lessons, religious lessons. So you learned about the Bible and about other things that were important as well. So they had to sit on a bench and do their religious studies, their catechism. Now, Grandpa's home was about halfway down the side of a steep hill, The road went from the top of the hill to the bottom, right past the front door, and in winter it was the best place for sliding downhill that you can possibly imagine. One week, Grandpa and his two brothers, James and George, were making a new sled. They worked on it every minute of their playtime. It was the best sled they had ever made, and it was so long that all three of them could sit on it, one behind the other. They planned to finish it in time to slide downhill Saturday afternoon. For every Saturday afternoon, they had 2 or 3 hours to play. But that week, their father was cutting down trees in the big woods. He was working hard, and he kept the boys working with him. They did all the morning chores by lantern light and were hard at work in the woods when the sun came up. They worked till dark, and then there were chores to do. And after supper, they had to go to bed so they could get up early in the morning. They had no time to work on the sled until Saturday afternoon. Then they worked at it just as fast as they could, but they didn't get it finished till just as the sun went down Saturday night. So you've made this awesome rockin' sled, but it's now Sunday, so you can't use the sled in the snow. This is what their sled looked like, and all the little woodworking tools that are near it, right? So they build this fantastic sled, but they can't use it because now it's Saturday night, which is the same thing as Sunday. After the sun went down, they could not slide downhill, not even once. That would be breaking the Sabbath. So they put the sled in the shed behind the house to wait until Sunday was over. All the 2 long hours in church the next day, while they kept their feet still and their eyes on the preacher, they were thinking about the sled. At home, while they ate dinner, they couldn't think of anything else. After dinner, their father sat down to read the Bible, and Grandpa and James and George sat as still as mice on their bench with their catechism, but they were thinking about the sled. The sun shone brightly, and the snow was smooth and glittering on the road. They could see it through the window. It was a perfect day for sliding downhill. They looked at their catechism, and they thought about the new sled, and it seemed that Sunday would never end. After a long time, they heard a snore. They looked at their father, and they saw that his head had fallen against the back of his chair, and he was fast asleep. Then James looked at George, and James got up from the bench and tiptoed out of the room through the back door. George looked at Grandpa, and George tiptoed after James. And Grandpa looked fearfully at their father, but on tiptoe he followed George and left their father snoring. This is what that looks like. Oops, sorry. So their dad's asleep and they're going to sneak out. They took their new sled and went quietly up to the top of the hill. They meant to slide down just once. Then they would put the sled away and slip back to their bench and the catechism before their father woke up. James sat in front on the sled, then George, and then Grandpa, because he was the littlest. You want the heavy person in the front because they're going to weight the sled and make it go down the hill faster, right? When I was a little kid, we lived on a hill and where it snowed up until I was 5. And we lived in that house, and it was on a very steep hill, very, very steep. And I remember one time I was on a sled with my mom, and we were just flying down the hill, and my mom was in back, and I was in the front. My mom was kind of holding on to me, and we hit a bump, like we hit something, and it cracked. It cracked the sled, and both of us kind of went flying off the sled, and we actually broke the sled. And so it probably would have been wiser to have her in front, because I think the crack happened in the back where she was sitting because she was heavier than I was. And I was pretty little, though. I would have had to have been holding on to her in the back. James sat in the front on the sled, then George, and then Grandpa because he was the littlest. The sled started at first slowly, and then faster and faster. It was running, flying down the long steep hill, but the boys dared not shout. They must slide silently past the house without waking their father. There was no sound except for the little whir of the runners on the snow and the wind rushing past. Then, just as the sled was swooping toward the house, A big black pig stepped out of the woods. He had walked into the middle of the road and stood there. The sled was going so fast it couldn't be stopped. Also, sleds only have like a string that you pull, and theirs didn't look like it had that. Our sled, modern sleds, had like strings that you pulled like reins on a horse if you're driving a wagon. And if you pull one way, the sled turns. If you pull the other way, the sled turns the other way, right? There's no such thing as brakes. The brakes are your feet, right? And if you're on a sled and you're going really fast downhill and you set your feet out, it's like skateboarding. If you're on a really fast moving skateboard and you set your foot down, you're you're gonna go flying off the skateboard or flying off the sled. So they're going really fast and they can't stop it because if they put their feet down, they'll all just fall off the sled. Then, just as the sled was swooping toward the house, a big black pig stepped out of the woods. He walked into the middle of the road and stood there. The sled was going so fast it couldn't be stopped. There wasn't time to turn it. The sled went right under the hog and picked him up. With a squeal, he sat down on James, and he kept on squealing long and loud and shrill. Squeak! Squeak! This is what it looks like. It's awesome. The pigs like going on their sled ride. They flashed by the house, the pig sitting in front, and then James, and then George, and then Grandpa. And they saw their father standing in the doorway looking at them. They couldn't stop. They couldn't hide. There was no time to say anything. Down the hill they went, the hog sitting on James and squealing all the way. At the bottom of the hill they stopped. The hog jumped off James and ran away into the woods, still squealing. The pig's like, ah, that was terrifying. The boys walked slowly and solemnly up the hill. They put the sled away. They sneaked into the house and slipped quietly to their places on the bench. Their father was reading his Bible. He looked up at them without saying a word. Then he went on reading, and they studied their catechism. So he can't spank them on Sunday because spanking would be breaking the Sabbath, right? But they know he's just going to beat them, right? Because they were really naughty. They broke the rules. But when the sun went down and the Sabbath day was over, their father took them out to the woodshed and tanned their jackets. That's a euphemism for spanked them. First James, then George, then Grandpa. So you see, Laura and Mary Pa said, you may find it hard to be good, but you should be glad that it isn't as hard to be good as it was when Grandpa was a boy. Did little girls have to be as good as that? Laura asked, and Ma said it was harder for little girls because they had to behave like little ladies all the time, not only on Sundays. Little girls could never slide downhill like boys. Little girls had to sit in the house and stitch on samplers. Now run along and let Ma put you to bed, said Pa, and he took the fiddle out of its box. Laura and Mary lay in their trundle bed and listened to the Sunday hymns, for even the fiddle must not sing the weekday songs on Sundays. Rock of Ages cleft for me, Pa sang with the fiddle, and then he sang, Shall I be carried to the skies on flowery beds of ease, while others fought to win the prize and sailed through bloody seas? Laura began to float away on the music, and then she heard a clattering noise, and there was Ma by the stove getting breakfast. It was Monday morning, and Sunday would not come back for a whole week. We will stop right there on page 97.